They called it the wedding of the century, a fairy tale written in diamonds and fireworks. But behind the gowns and champagne was something else entirely. Hidden cameras and chandeliers, contracts disguised as love letters, and a secret operation with one chilling name: Project Venice. What looked like a love story was in truth a blueprint for destruction, a marriage engineered not for romance, but for surveillance, leverage, and control. And when the first photograph leaked, the illusion shattered. Tonight, we uncover how the most glamorous wedding in Hollywood became the most dangerous trap ever staged. In Venice, the canals whispered with old secrets. The palazzos held shadows of centuries, and the air itself carried the weight of masquerades and illusions. It was here, amid gondolas slipping through narrow waters and cameras flashing at carefully staged moments, that the story began not with a kiss, not with a vow, not with a ring, but with an envelope. A thin, plain envelope that carried inside it a single photograph. A photograph that looked ordinary to anyone else. But to her, it was a weapon. She had stepped onto the balcony in a gown designed to command attention, a smile rehearsed for the world eyes drawn toward the future that had been scripted for her. But on the table beside the champagne was the envelope unmarked Silent Daring. To be opened, she knew what it contained before her fingers even broke the seal. Her life had been a string of performances, rehearsed, choreographed, every glance and every step, calculated to fit into a picture that the public would consume. But this photograph was different. This was not for the cameras. This was not for the headlines. This was for her alone. The image inside was simple, grainy, not polished, not staged a still frame taken from a distance, yet it cut deeper than any headline ever. Could there? She was caught unguarded, a silhouette moving where she was not supposed to be walking through a corridor, when the world believed she was asleep whispering words to someone whose face was blurred, but whose presence told a story that could not be denied. This photograph was proof not of love, but of surveillance. Not of romance, but of control. In that moment, she realized she was not the bride. She was the evidence, her movements documented, her gestures captured, her private words turned into exhibits in a case she had never agreed to. She had thought she was walking into a love story, into a future with the richest man in the world. But what she had truly entered was a courtroom without walls. A legal battleground where her every breath was a deposition outside the crowd. Cheered tourists snapped pictures, gondoliers sang their timeless songs, unaware that the woman on the balcony was staring not at the sunset, but at the image that dismantled her life piece by piece. She could feel the walls closing in the palazzo. No longer looked like a palace, it felt like a cell. She tried to smile again to remind herself that appearances mattered, but the weight of the photograph pressed down heavier than any jewel could. The irony was cruel. The dress had been chosen to blind the cameras, the jewelry to dazzle the tabloids, the setting to ignite the fairy tale. Yet the real story, the story no one saw, was unfolding in silence, in the space between her trembling fingers. In the grainy photograph, the world believed they were watching a romance in Venice. But what they were truly witnessing was the opening act of a war. Every great scandal begins with an illusion shattered. Every courtroom battle begins with a piece of evidence, and every downfall begins with the moment a secret refuses to stay hidden. Venice was not just a backdrop, it was the stage of the first revelation. The canals reflected beauty. But beneath the surface, the waters carried betrayal, and as the gondolas drifted past under bridges where lovers carved their names, she stood motionless with a photograph that told her she was no longer a woman in love. She was a target in a game she never volunteered to play. Her mind replayed the months. Before the whispered promises, the glittering dinners, the carefully orchestrated photographs that painted the image of perfect love. She had believed some of it. She wanted to believe all of it, but the photograph did not lie. It never smiled. It never pretended it simply existed, and its existence was enough to fracture everything she thought was real. The irony was sharper still, that the richest man alive who could buy any treasure, any secret, any silence chose to buy surveillance instead. Love had become data, affection had become evidence. Romance had become leverage, and she, the bride, had become a file to be stored. a record to be used when the time was right in that balcony moment. She was not just holding paper, she was holding the contract. Of her own captivity, the gondolas continued, the sun dipped lower. The tourists applauded the illusion, and somewhere behind the lenses of hidden cameras, another photograph was already being taken. The story was not ending with the envelope. It was only beginning. In Manhattan, far from the canals and masks of Venice, a room without windows glowed with the light of screens. Maps scattered across a table, legal folders stacked in towers, cables curling across the floor like veins feeding into machines. The room did not look like love. It looked like strategy. And in this room, the wedding was not discussed as romance. It was discussed as Project Venice. They called it that, not because of beauty, not because of gondolas, but because Venice was the location. Where illusion would be perfected and where evidence would be gathered, the strategists knew that appearances mattered more than truth. They knew that headlines could be crafted, that photographs could be staged, that whispers could be planted. But beneath the sparkle of diamond rings and staged embraces, their focus was simple control. The war room was populated not by florists or planners, but by attorneys in sharp suits, investigators who spoke in clipped tones, analysts who traced her movements. On screens in real time, on one wall, a map of Venice dotted with red pins, each pin marking a camera, each camera marking a perspective on her life. This was not romance. This was surveillance theater every hour. Her schedule was updated not for beauty, but for evidence. Every conversation was cataloged. Every whisper stored in files coded by date, time, and location. It was not enough for them to celebrate her. They needed to control her. Not enough to promise forever. They needed leverage forever. The prenup sat in the center of the table like a sacred text. The attorneys flipped its pages as if it were scripture. The clauses highlighted in red ink lines that twisted love into obligation, romance into liability forever, into conditions. They debated each word, not as vows, but as weapons. How to shield the empire, how to secure the fortune, how to ensure that no matter how public the love seemed, the private control would never be broken to the strategists. She was not a woman. She was an asset to be measured, quantified, and managed. She was a risk profile. She was a liability matrix. She was a headline waiting to be turned into leverage. They spoke of her as though she were a stock that could rise or fall, and their task was to keep. Her contained behind one screen, a private investigator played the footage. Grainy clips of her steps through corridors, of her smiles, at dinners of her phone calls caught on mics hidden in flowers. Each clip paused, analyzed, debated, labeled. This was not a wedding. It was a trial being prepared in advance. The evidence already stacked, the verdict already written. They called it Project Venice. But it could have been called anything. Its purpose was the same: to make sure that love was never love. It was compliance, to make sure that romance was never romance. It was surveillance, to make sure that she never belonged to herself, but to the narrative they owned. The war room hummed with printers and whispers, attorneys writing clauses, investigators marking maps, strategists preparing press releases. They already knew the stories that would appear in the tabloids before they were printed. They already knew the questions reporters would ask before they were spoken. The illusion of spontaneity was rehearsed in detail. Even her laughter was timed, even her gaze choreographed. The lawyers reminded them that photographs alone were not enough. Photographs could be denied, but patterns could not be. So they built dossiers, not just images, but timelines of her life. Her presence cross-checked against receipts, her conversations matched with transcripts, her travels plotted against his schedule. If she whispered in a corner, it became a footnote in a file. If she lingered too long, it became a red flag. If she smiled at the wrong face, it became an exhibit in waiting. One strategist leaned back and whispered that the wedding itself was the ultimate stage, because a wedding was sacred to the public, untouchable to critics. It could be dressed in white and gold, it could be wrapped in lace and vows, and for that reason, no one would dare call it what it truly was, a fortress of surveillance disguised as a celebration. And so the planning continued. Vendors contacted not for beauty, but for cover photographers hired not for glamour, but for evidence, florists chosen because they carried microphones in the stems of roses, makeup artists briefed to conceal more than blemishes. They concealed, fatigue concealed, fear concealed cracks in the illusion. Every person who entered the Palace of Venice believed they were serving love. But in truth, they served the project. The war room never slept at night. The monitors still glowed, her face frozen mid-laughter. Her silhouette caught in stairwells. Her voice softened into static whispers captured forever. The team took shifts, lawyers leaving, investigators arriving, strategists rotating, but the screens never went dark one night. An attorney asked quietly, "What if she refuses? What if she sees through it?" But the strategist only smiled. She will not refuse, because refusal requires freedom, and freedom is the one thing she will never be allowed to hold in Manhattan. They raised glasses not to love, but to control, not to forever, but to ownership. They toasted to the illusion they had perfected, to the empire they had secured, to the evidence they had locked away in steel cabinets. The photograph on the balcony was only the first. There would be hundreds, thousands each one. Another thread in the net that surrounded her, and as the sun rose over the city, the war room dimmed its lights. The strategists closed their folders, the attorneys locked the cabinets. The investigators saved the footage project. Venice was not finished. It was only beginning, for in a few weeks the canals would fill with music, the guests would gather, the tabloids would cheer, and the world would believe it was watching a wedding, when in truth it was watching a siege disguised as a vow. In Venice, the city itself became a stage. The canals shimmered under lights, the balconies draped in velvet, the air thick with perfume and whispers. But none of it was spontaneous. None of it was free. The war room in Manhattan had written the script months before, and now it was time for the players to perform. She arrived in silence, wrapped in gowns that spoke of royalty, her hair a crown, her jewels reflecting not only wealth, but also the contracts hidden behind them. Every diamond insured, every pearl cataloged, every bracelet listed as an asset in documents sealed away in New York to the world. She was a bride to the strategists. She was a signature walking through marble halls. The photographers positioned along the canals were told they had freedom to capture magic. But the truth was, their spots had been marked with chalk days earlier. Angles measured, lighting calculated, even the gondoliers who floated past with songs had been rehearsed, instructed on when to appear, when to vanish, when to fill silence with music. The illusion was romance. The reality was choreography. Guests spoke in hushed tones as they arrived, not all aware of the deeper plan, but each one part of the scenery. Celebrities flown in on private jets. Executives seated beside actors, fashion icons dressed to shimmer under cameras. The guest list itself was a strategy, each name chosen to reinforce the narrative of power and prestige, to remind the world that this was not just a wedding, it was an empire binding itself together. When she smiled across the table at him, the crowd sighed, but the strategists watched her eyes. Watched the hesitation behind the laughter, watched for cracks in the illusion. One misplaced glance could become a headline, one whispered doubt could unravel the script, so she kept her smile steady. Her laughter smooth, her hands always linked to his, not out of choice, but out of necessity in private moments. There were no private moments, every room held lenses, disguised as chandeliers. Every hallway echoed with microphones disguised as flowers. Even the mirrors held secrets, silvered glass concealing cameras. Her reflection watched by strangers, her sighs recorded by machines. There was no intimacy, only surveillance wrapped in silk. The vows were written as poetry, but debated in boardrooms. Each word tested for resonance, for risk, for permanence. Lawyers had cut through drafts, replacing passion with precision, replacing spontaneity with strategy. Even the phrase forever had been highlighted in contracts, though in truth, forever meant until leverage shifts when the priest spoke of unity. The strategists marked checkboxes when the crowd applauded. The analysts noted timestamps when the kiss was shared on the balcony. The photographers clicked, not as witnesses to love, but as archivists of evidence. Each photo another layer of control, another frame in the dossier that defined her. The city cheered, but the palace was cold. Its marble halls, echoing with the sound of heels on stone laughter, layered with unease to outsiders. It was magic to insiders. It was theater. And for her, it was a cage woven with gold throughout the evening. Whispers rippled among guests, some questioned the scale, the extravagance, the unspoken weight behind the smiles others marveled at the opulence, unable to see the invisible wires that held the spectacle together. She moved among them, graceful, perfect, radiant, but beneath the surface, her heart pounded, with the knowledge that none of it belonged to her. Not the gown, not the jewels, not even her image, which was already trademarked, licensed, and monetized by those who owned the empire. As midnight approached, the canals glowed with fireworks. 1,000. Sparks reflected on water. 1,000 cheers echoing through stone corridors. The world believed it was watching the height of romance, but for her it was the height of performance. Her tears hid her doubts, buried her silence louder than the bells that rang through the city. The strategists in Manhattan watched on screens, their faces lit by the glow of celebration happening thousands of miles away. They saw not a wedding, but a success project. Venice was complete, the illusion flawless, the control sealed. They toasted not to love, but to leverage, not to unity, but to ownership. Yet in the silence of her chamber, as the last guests departed, as the fireworks dimmed as the city slept, she sat alone before a mirror, and for the first time, all night there were no cameras, only her reflection staring back, the jewels heavy on her neck, the gown pooling at her feet, her eyes red with exhaustion. She whispered to herself a vow no one else would hear. I will not be theirs forever, but the walls were thick. The contracts sealed the evidence already locked in cabinets across the ocean. Her vow was only an echo, swallowed by marble, yet still it lived a seed of resistance, a spark that no strategist could extinguish. And so the illusion of romance became the beginning of the war, not between bride and groom, not between love and duty, but between freedom and control, between the woman she was and the image they demanded her to be. The world saw the kiss, the laughter, the fireworks, the perfect romance in Venice. What they did not see was the silence of her mirror, the vow of resistance whispered into stone. And that silence was louder than any cheer, for it marked the moment when illusion cracked and truth began to fight its way through. The fireworks in Venice had barely faded when the headlines began to rise around the world. Covers splashed with images of the kiss on the balcony, the embrace by the canal, the jewels that shimmered against the night. The media called it the wedding of the century. But to those who had lived it, to those who had been trapped within its walls, the silence after the celebration was heavier than the cheers that had filled the air. She returned to Manhattan with him, the palace replaced by a tower of glass and steel, the canals replaced by streets that never slept. Reporters gathered outside every doorway, fans waiting with cameras. The illusion followed her across the ocean, yet inside her body there was a tremor. She had smiled too long, played her role too perfectly, and now alone behind tinted windows, she felt the weight of what had been signed, what had been surrendered. The strategists declared victory. The war room was dismantled, the maps of Venice rolled away, the dossiers sealed into vaults. Attorneys congratulated themselves on a plan executed with precision. Investors whispered that the empire was safer now. Safer because she was contained, safer because the illusion had been broadcast to billions, safer because leverage was locked into contracts and photographs. But safety for them meant silence for her. And silence is never forever. Silence cracks when the heart resists. In the days that followed, she noticed the small signs, the constant presence of aides who never left the room, the schedules dictated to the minute, the photographs staged at dawn with makeup already fixed, the way her phone calls ended more quickly than they began, the way her laughter was met not with warmth but with analysis. The marriage felt less like a bond and more like a performance, with no intermission at dinners. She would look across the table at him and wonder where the man had gone. The man she thought she had chosen, the man whose smile once seemed to belong to her alone. Now his smile was a brand. Now his embrace was strategy. Now his words came scripted. She wondered if he saw her anymore, or only the reflection that the strategists demanded. Whispers began to ripple through circles of Hollywood insiders. Some said the romance looked too perfect. Others said the smiles seemed rehearsed. Still others swore they had seen her step away, eyes glistening, lips trembling, as if holding back words she could never say. And yet in public, she remained flawless, the perfect bride, the perfect partner, the perfect illusion. The tabloids feasted on the spectacle, their stories filled with praise but buried in comment sections and late-night whispers. Another tone began to rise. Questions, doubts, speculations about what was hidden behind the silk curtains, about what deals were signed behind locked doors, about why the love story seemed too polished to be real. The cracks widened slowly in private moments when she found herself staring out of windows for hours in quiet. Dinners where conversation felt thinner than the wine glasses in her hand, in photo shoots where she wanted to scream, but instead tilted her head just so because that was the angle chosen by the handlers. Even he began to show strain, his laughter. A second late, his touch lighter than before, his voice sharp when no microphones were near, and though the strategists insisted it was nothing, she knew the truth. Illusions can be choreographed, but they cannot survive forever without cracks. Illusions demand energy, and energy fades. The pressure of empire, mixed with the pressure of surveillance every day, became another test. Every movement, another entry in files stored by lawyers, every step another chance for headlines to be shaped by strategists. Her freedom was reduced to schedules, her image reduced to angles, her soul reduced to silence, and yet silence carries seeds within it. One evening in the tower alone for a rare hour, she looked again into a mirror, the same mirror that had once heard her vow of resistance in Venice. And she whispered again, "Not forever this time." The whisper carried more strength. This time, it was not only a vow, it was a plan. The aftermath of the wedding had been designed to be seamless, to be unbreakable. But the strategists had forgotten one truth. Illusions are fragile when the person at the center begins to resist. No contract, no dossier, no headline can contain a heart that chooses freedom. And so the cracks began as whispers, then as glances, then as silences, but each one was louder than the last. Each one spreading across the marble halls and glass towers, each one marking the beginning of an unraveling that no strategist could stop. The wedding had been a fortress of surveillance dressed as a celebration, but the aftermath revealed the truth. Fortresses can hold enemies at bay, but when the resistance rises within the walls, the empire itself begins to tremble, and so the world continued to cheer. The headlines continued to praise. The empire continued to expand, but within the heart of the bride. Within the silence of her reflection, the battle had begun, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks in the illusion widened into fractures into breaks and breaks, into collapse. At the end of the day, Hollywood isn't just about glamour and red carpets. It's about power, secrets, and the scandals that often stay hidden until the truth forces its way into the spotlight. Whether it's courtroom drama, relationship, chaos, or behind-the-scenes deals, one thing is certain: the story never ends here, and as always, we'll be watching, digging, and uncovering the pieces others try to keep buried.